Hi, I'm Andrew Dowling, a veterinarian with PGG Wrightson. In this presentation, I'm going to talk about a study we ran on a farm over 3 years to try and introduce some drench susceptible worms. Now, my contact details are there. If you have any questions, please get in touch. Don't take this as gospel. This is a report on the study that what we did on the farm, and there'll be some things that you don't understand or that aren't clear, so please get in touch before you implement some of these things. So this study was done on a farm. As you can see from the pictures, the farm is very flat. It's 540 hectares with things that are called technosystems. The technosystems here, you have the outline of the system, and then you have little cells. So it's basically rotational grazing, just in very small paddocks. And the stock move up the system and down. You can either go up and down here, or you can run it as a whole system where you can split it into two, or have one big system. So they're in there. There's rotational grazing. The farm has contracts with breeder farms to supply lambs, and they arrive having their quarantine drench and both of their 5-in-1 clostridial vaccinations. Now, in May 2019, there were lamb deaths on the farm, and fecal egg counts 7 days or 8 days after a triple drench range between 700 and 4,500. After a drench, we shouldn't see any eggs in the feces for about 21 days. So this indicates two things. So we went and checked another farm and also had eggs in there, that the drench wasn't effective against the adult worms and they are laying eggs. And also those egg counts are fairly high. So we've got a reasonably high worm challenge on this farm, with quite a high burden of parasites in these lambs. And that's certainly going to be impacting their production. There are 22,000 lambs on this farm to get through the winter, and the farmer wasn't looking forward to it. So what was done? We drenched all the lambs with StarTect. Now, this is an absolute game changer. From the farmer's comments, the scouring dried up. The lambs stopped dying, they filled up. He said even within days, they looked so much better. And so it was a reminder of just how important an effective drench is and what impact that has. We did fecal egg count on lambs 4, 6, and 8 weeks later to determine when to drench again, being worried about the larval challenge. And they weren't too bad, so I think we got lucky and didn't have too many parasites on the farm. Now, were there any warning lights? I suppose in hindsight you can always find some. There are a couple of drench checks where we had some eggs, but it was difficult to say whether that was because the drench had failed or because it was just the drenching practice was poor and the lambs hadn't all been drenched properly. The farm had moved to using a couple of 21-day drench intervals in the autumn, and we talked to them about this, and it was because we're hitting some very high larval challenges at the time. And I think this is actually quite common in a lot of our farm systems, and it is a shot across our bows that the parasites are getting out of control. Due to targeting the spring market, growth rates weren't a concern. It was actually, the target was to get the lambs through the winter and make money on the spring market. And I think that's been a feature of many of our lamb finishing systems for the last few years. And the wheels just literally flew off. So hindsight is dangerous. So while there were warning signs, it was actually still working okay. Now, we went out and we diagnosed a Talidosargia and a Trichostrongylus resistance on this farm and these lamb worms, so that wasn't good. With the studies from New Zealand, we know that when you've got an ineffective drench, it can cost you 14% of the carcass value over 4 months. So either make less money from those lambs, or to get them to the killable weights, they've got to eat a lot more grass. So either way, it costs a lot of money. Now, lamb finishing was a significant part of this farm business. Fixing a drug addiction with a different drug doesn't work, so it wasn't just about changing the colour of the drum we used. And just moving to finishing cattle wouldn't necessarily fix it either, because if we went to a young cattle system and used a lot of drenching, then we could end up in the same boat with cattle parasites. The farm doesn't suit running a ewe flock, and this drench resistance was going to have a significant impact on the breeder farms as farm purchase lambs off, and also the meat companies that the lambs are sold to. So sat down with the farm and thought, well, initially we've got to look at changing the farm system. We needed to reduce the worm challenge, And one of those ways of doing that on the farm was to have fewer lamb days on grass, because each day the lamb was on there and could be putting out parasite eggs was going to increase the larval challenge. Why do we want to decrease the larval challenge? This is work done in New Zealand where over a 14-week period they looked at the growth rates of the lambs. So up to 16 kilos down to as low for this group here over 14 weeks they put on about almost 8 kilos. Now these lambs, they came in parasite free. How they were managed differently over the 14 weeks of the trial was that one group had no parasites at all. One group had 1,000 larvae a day. Another group had 5,000 larvae a day. And the fourth group had 5,000 larvae a day, but were given an effective drench every 21 days at 3-week intervals, which, as you should be aware, is a drenching at 3-weekly intervals is not recommended, because it certainly hastens the development of drench resistance, because we have no refugia in that system. So these lambs were ran for the 14 weeks. When you look at the growth rates, the group that grew the slowest had the 5,000 larvae per day. Now the lambs that had 5,000 larvae a day but were drenched every 3 weeks didn't grow that much faster. Whereas you look up here at the group that only had 1,000 larvae a day or no parasites at all, they grew significantly faster. So what this tells me is that the fewer parasites your stock eat every day, the better they do, regardless of how effective your drench is. So we want to reduce that larval challenge. We want to have fewer drenches per lamb, because every time we drench the lamb, we select for drench resistance, because we're leaving resistant worms in the gut of the animal and they get to breed together, getting a breeding advantage. When you went to using knockout drenches during the year. So the theory of the knockout drench is using a novel drench like Zolvix or StarTect during your drenching program for your lambs to try and help protect your routine drench. So in these here, the taller the column, the longer it takes to get resistance compared to the shorter column. So in this example here with these here, if you didn't use a knockout drench at all, it might take about this here about 60 cycles of this model to get resistance. If you use it as a first drench, it was slightly better. As a third drench, but there's a fifth drench, it certainly greatly increased the length of time to getting resistance. Now, for your farm system, the timing of this knockout drench may vary. So certainly talk to your veterinarian or your advisor as to when the best time to use it. So knockout drench during the year, we started implementing that. We got more cattle into the system. That was to help reduce the worm challenge as well. And where possible, had the lambs and the cattle grazing together in the techno system, which really is very much like a rotational grazing system. Then we wanted to see if we could introduce and maintain a population of drench susceptible worms in refugia. And of course, the farmer wanted to know what drench to use. So went out and got the breeder farmers together and had a number of talks with them. Because the more susceptible their worms are, the better. But we also want to talk about other things that the breeder farmers can do that help our lambs adapt to being on the finishing farm. The better they adapt, the faster they grow, the fewer drenches that are required. But there are also other diseases like pneumonia that can have a significant impact on lamb finishing systems as well. So we wanted to talk about those. So we involved the local veterinarians to do fecal egg count reduction tests. We involved Dave Leathwick at Ag Research, and we did some worm-wise workshops with these farmers. Now, even if your worms are all drench susceptible, and that's a really good result, there's still parts of your worm program that you can improve on. Like, nobody is perfect, and I think that's that's important. There's always things you can do, but breeders are certainly part of the system. Drench resistance is not just an issue for the finishing farmers to deal with. So because we had the techno systems, we could run a study. We set up one techno as a refugia farmlet and another techno system as a normal farmlet. So on this refugia farmlet, the lambs were introduced, and in January, February and March, 20% weren't given a quarantine drench. So these lambs were coming from a farm that we knew had a very good drench susceptible worms. The other 80% were quarantine drenched. They were fecally counted, monitored to determine when to re-drench, and that re-drench was with a triple combination oral. Okay. From April onwards, all lambs were quarantine drenched in because we didn't want to end up with an autumn larval peak. So we wanted to try and make sure we didn't bring in too many worms, and also we weren't that happy that any worms brought in after this period would actually survive to become infective larvae to add to our refugia. Cattle were grazed in the system. The cattle were largely undrenched because they were mainly R2 cattle in there. And in years 2 and 3, we reduced the numbers of lambs undrenched to 5% because we made the system too wormy, as we'll show you shortly, and we only didn't drench them in December and January. The normal farmlet run the same as the quarantine, the refugia one, apart from all lambs were quarantine drenched. But if 100 lambs were sold out of the system, then 100 lambs were brought back in. It was the same for both systems. Okay. So yeah, and in the simile here, the routine drench was with a triple. So the impact of the refugia introduction. So we certainly had some impact in that first year. We looked at the normal farmlet. We had a fecal count of 304 against 720. So we had made the refugia farmlet quite a bit wormier, and we'd also had introduced more Barber's pole worms. Okay, so the larval culture was 67% Barber's pole worm. That doesn't mean that 67% of the worms in the lambs are Barber's pole, but it showed that we were seeding that area with Barber's pole worm eggs, which we didn't want to do. So it's not just about bringing in undrenched lambs. This is a video of some larvae. So these are infective L3, and these are what your lambs eat on pasture. When a larval culture is done from your fecal egg count, the larvae are hatched out, and then they are identified to try and determine what they are. Now, this is determined on the length of the parasite, but a significant factor is the length of their tails. So we have short tails here. Trichostrongylus is shorter than Talidosargia. These are medium tails. Well, this one here is a medium tail larvae. This could be a Cuperia homunculus, and this long-tailed one here could be a Nematodiris Esophagosum Schubertia. So, along with the length of the tail, the length of the parasite, the width of it, the shape of the head and other features, the technician in the lab can identify what parasites you've got. So we ran this program for 3 years and did a fecal egg count reduction test, which we just completed in June. Have a look at what we've done. So the starting larval cultures from the two, the fecal from the normal group at the top against the refugia group down below here. The parasite burden was similar. Look at here, we had many more Trichostrongylus in the refugia farmlet compared to the normal farmlet. And we went through and looked at the results of the reduction test here for the calculated efficacy against Talidosargia was 99% in the normal block, which is very high, against 63% in the refugia block. So this is calculated efficacies, and we've gotten that way by doing the lambs either drenched with an abamectin, a levamisole, or an oxfendazole, and then we use those calculations there, or these efficacies here, to calculate how effective the triple drench would be. Okay, so and both of these would set an improvement. Okay, so back in 2019, this Talidosargia had been at 29% efficacy, and a Trichostrongylus, the next one we're looking at, had been at 71%. So we look at Trichostrongylus, it had gone down to 0 efficacy in the normal farmlet against 90% in the refugia farmlet. Okay? So yeah, we had a real difference between the efficacy here and the routine one that had really crashed, and we'd had an improvement in the refugia farmlet. So what have we achieved? We've lowered the worm challenge, and the farmer tells us that because the lambs are growing better. Okay, and that's a win. The Talidosargia efficacy has improved on both blocks, so it's sort of a win. Okay, it hadn't improved as much on the refugia one, but any improvement is good. Don't look for perfection all the time. The Trichos strongest efficacy has improved significantly in the refugia block, so that's a real win. Now, we didn't speciate those Trichos strongest worms. There are 3 species of them, but we certainly had an improvement there. The lambs are growing again and not dying, so we've got a very happy farmer, so that's definitely an improvement. So it's easy. Let's go out and buy some drench susceptible, or some lambs with drench susceptible worms in them and bring them on the farm. No, it's not that simple. These lambs do grow slower than the ones that are drenched. In my experience, it's 20 to 50%, but others haven't seen such a significant impact. But everything we do has an impact. They do grow slower. They need to have the right worm species. As we saw with those barber's pole worm I was introducing, that wasn't desirable. Now, even if you go into a farm that's got really drench susceptible worms, once those lambs have been drenched, you are concentrating some resistant worms inside them. So ideally for me, these lambs have never been drenched to come onto your farm, or their last drench with a Startect or a Zolvix Plus. So I think it's a bit of a stretch to think if a lamb's had 4 or 5 drenches through the season and you're bringing them onto the farm in the autumn, that there aren't going to be any resistant worms inside them. Okay, so it's not just about not bringing in some undrenched lambs from a farm that's got a good reduction test. And we also need to maintain those worms in the system. So we've got to have a way of maintaining them in refugia once we get them into the finishing system. So for this farm, what's that? The drenching plan we've been working on is that each lamb gets a maximum of 3 drenches, preferably 2. So that would be their quarantine drench in, a routine drench with a triple, and then maybe 1 more routine drench with a triple. So the lambs come in at heavier weights. Okay, that's been a big change. So they are held on conditioning farms until they're 36 kilos and then come into the finishing farm. So they may go from the breeder to a conditioner and then onto this finishing property. So the lambs are quarantine drenched into the finishing farm, and they've had their 5-on-1s. And the fecal egg count is monitoring sort of been done to determine when to drench again. Because if we're reducing the worm challenge, we're also reducing the refugia. So we must reduce the number of drenches we're using, otherwise we're going to quite rapidly select for resistance again. As I said, our triple oral is our routine drench. And we've been doing some more drench checking 7 to 14 days after the drench to see how effective it is to determine what the next drench will be. Okay. If Zolvix was a quarantine, then Startect is a knockout in that season and vice versa. And also if we use Startect, it was Zolvix as a quarantine 1 year, we moved to Startect the next. Now I'm not sure how important that is doing the year-to-year rotation. Because over a 20-year period, we may end up using both drenches at the same number of times. But I don't think that you want to be using Zolvix or Startect as your sole quarantine drench or your sole knockout drench infinitum. So in June 2022, what's been run on Kuminga, 28 mobs of lambs and 34 mobs of bulls. That's a fairly busy system. Okay. The lambs and bulls have been separated for soil and plant conservation reasons, and they'll be brought back together again in October. There'll be very few lambs on the farm in November to January, okay, of the farming system. And so some blocks will have mainly cattle for up to 6-month period, so they'll have a very low worm or sheep worm population. So in 2023, things we want to look at is what's the ideal delay between bull and lamb grazing, both to reduce the number of larvae grazed, but also for pasture quality. We want to make the most of these low worm challenge paddocks. So we really need to determine, how long we can stretch out that drench interval early in the season. So do more fecal egg count monitoring for that. But we still are really short of refugia. So need to start looking at maybe trading some undrenched ewes in the system. And want to look at whether we leave 5% of lambs undrenched. Now we're seeing an improvement in that efficacy. And we'll want to look at doing a drench efficacy test in those cattle as well. So that's the presentation. As I said at the start, if you have any questions, please come back to me. But I think we have made an improvement on this farm. Thank you.